afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Sohani Char. I am a clinical psychologist that works at the Developmental Assessment Clinic and the Unicorn Children's Foundation Clinic. And today I have the pleasure to cover a very important topic that I think will be very beneficial. And this is something that I'm very passionate about, and it's identifying the red flags in autism spectrum disorder. So I hope everyone thinks that this is informative and that everyone can learn something from this presentation. All right, so like I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about identifying red flags of autism. I introduced myself, and Dr. Amrita Singh is also one of the licensed psychologists in the Unicorn Children's Foundation Clinic. And what we do is we provide comprehensive assessments for children who are suspected of having autism, who are experiencing developmental delays, and who are exhibiting behavioral difficulties. So we go ahead and do it in a very comprehensive assessment, looking at adaptive functioning, looking at cognitive functioning, as well as social emotional functioning. And we use gold standard assessment tools to be able to determine what exactly is happening with the child and what we can do to help, which is the really the important part of what we do. And we supervise postdoctoral psychology residents as well as clinical practicum students who are in the doctoral program. So the reason we're here today is because many of you might be teachers, many of you might be parents, and awareness of autism is very important. It's crucial in terms of getting services to services, at an early age for children. So really, it's important to understand what the red flags are and what we can do to help. So in the autism spectrum disorder, we're going to talk about the prevalence. We're going to talk about diagnostic criteria. We're also going to cover some of those early red flags of autism that you sometimes see in children. And we're going to also touch on certain misconceptions of ASD, as well as the process for diagnosis that you may have. So the reason why we're here, like we said, is we're going to talk about autism. We're going to discuss prevalence rates, review the red flags, and we're going to identify recommendations. So the reason why you are listening in is because you want to know more about autism and you want to help children, families, and people. And that's really why we are here, because we want to bring that awareness to the community. We know that sometimes families have challenges. And like all families, children, with autism, families with children with autism are going to have some challenges that maybe they don't encounter in typically developing children, but nevertheless, there are challenges, and how we can overcome those challenges is going to be important. The one thing that we want to emphasize is that it's not about labeling. So really, it's about making sure that we can determine, identify what is occurring with the child and how we can best help the child. So what recommendations can we provide to a child so that they can succeed academically, behaviorally, and socially? So really, that's the reason why we are learning about this. And also, it's about your impact, because many times we might think that the small decisions that we make don't really have a big impact on the lives of children and families, but I can tell you that everything that we do has an impact on children and families. So the first thing that we want to talk about is prevalence. So we know that 1 in 54 children have been identified with autism spectrum disorder, and this is according to the most recent statistics from the Centers for Disease and Control, CDC. And we know that it's about 4 times more common among boys than in girls. There's still literature, there's still research that is being conducted to really identify why this happens. But the one thing that really stood out is that the number of children who are age 3 or younger are being identified more. So the statistics went from 74 to 84%. So this is the sign that there is some potential progress, and that children younger than 3 are being able to be diagnosed and get access to services earlier on. The earliest that we see children in our clinic, we see children as young as 18 months. By 18 months, we can reliably diagnose autism, and that's something that we definitely try to make sure that that information is being given to the community, because sometimes families have to go through a process and sometimes they get identified later on, and they kind of miss out on that crucial intervention period. It doesn't mean that it's too late, but the earlier you can get her services, the better it's going to be for the child. And we all know that autism, it's going to be different for every single person. So the things that we're going to talk about today, you'll see that just because you do one of the things that we talk about doesn't mean you automatically have autism. But it means that we have to look further and see what all of the symptoms a child is really demonstrating to be able to determine what might be happening. So before autism spectrum disorder, um, you know, the children who were having symptoms or characteristics of autism might have been told that they have autism, Asperger's, pervasive developmental disorder. So before, what we know as autism now, it included Asperger's, it included pervasive developmental disorder. But now it's really, the diagnosis really, it's a lot broader and it encompasses all of these diagnoses that before were diagnosed and no longer are. But we know that it's a rainbow, like the visual says, so it appears differently from where you're standing, and it is filled with a range of colors. So that's a definition for the rainbow of autism spectrum. Now we know that ASD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. We definitely know that, and we know that there are two areas where children with autism have difficulty. So we know that they demonstrate deficits in social communication and interaction, and we also know that they demonstrate restricted repetitive behaviors. And in this talk, we're going to talk about the different examples, because what is a deficit in social communication and what is a restricted repetitive behavior? Most people have a better idea of what social communication deficits look like, but not a lot of people understand restricted repetitive behaviors. And that's why today we're going to give you more of an idea and show you exactly what it might look like so that you can better identify that in children. Okay, the first one is deficit in social communication interaction. So basically, one of the things that we see is that the child may not be able to reciprocate a conversation, or if they do have a conversation, it might be something about things that they enjoy only. So that can be one of the red flags. If they don't have conversation, is how they play with other children can be suggestive of autism. So maybe they're not taking turns, maybe they're not really engaging in reciprocal play. So all of that is important to look at, the way they're playing, the way they're interacting. Another red flag, not initiating or responding to social interaction. So maybe you call them Johnny, Johnny, they don't respond to your name. Abnormal eye contact, so maybe they're not really looking at you and smiling, combining smiling and eye contact. They're not really integrating a variety of gestures. So typically, if you want something, you might say, Johnny, I want, and whatever the object might be. So if you want something, you might say, Johnny, I want that. So you're integrating eye contact, vocalizations, and gestures. So you're integrating all three modes of communication to be able to request what it is that you want. Sometimes with autism, they might just say something, but they might say like milk, but they're not really looking at you. So that's something that we want to look at, whether their vocalizations are directed to someone else. The other thing is lack of facial expression. Sometimes you'll see extremes like enjoyment and frustration, but you don't really see a variety of facial expressions like surprise, shock, confusion. So those are things that we can also look at. And then difficulties in developing, maintaining relationships. So this might be a child, if they're younger in preschool, they might engage in solitary play, not really engage in cooperative play. And they might have an absence of interest in peers. It doesn't mean that every single child who is on the spectrum is going to have these things, but you want to look at some of these things and kind of see what it is exactly that they're demonstrating in order to see if there are some red flags for autism, and that's when you would refer them to get a full evaluation to determine whether it is autism, maybe a global developmental delay, but it's great to do an evaluation to be able to determine what the child is experiencing and how to best help the child. Now, when we talk about restricted repetitive behavior, sometimes we talk, um, psychologists will say RRBs for short. And what does this look like? So we want to know what this looks like so that you can be able to identify it. Repetitive motor movements can be things like spinning. It can be things like hand flapping when the child is excited. They might engage in hand flapping. It can be jumping repetitively. It can be running from one side to the other. It can be things like spinning, like I mentioned before. And then other stereotyped ways or unusual ways of playing with things, or maybe to line things up. Sometimes you see that they line things up or stack rocks and they play with that repetitively. So that's something that you want to have an eye for. We also have repetitive speech, like saying the same phrase over and over again. Sometimes they'll repeat lines from TV shows like maybe Peppa Pig, and they maybe even imitate the sound or the accent of the person stating, the line. So they might say, "Oh, maybe someone from their they are repeating lines from Peppa Pig, and they might say, "No more lovely dinners." That's something that I've seen in children. So you might think that they're British, but really they're not British. Their parents are Hispanic or American, but they watch a show with a character who's from Britain, and they'll copy the same accent. And then we also have the restricted interest, like, always wanting to talk about the same thing or always wanting to play with the same thing. In younger children, you might see this with numbers. You might see this with letters. Everything that they do, every single toy that they get, it has to be about what they like. And it can be letters, it can be a certain color, it can be, numbers. When they get older, it might be a very restricted, very special interest in things like the Civil War. It can be fossils or dinosaurs, different type. I had a child who I evaluated, and he was very interested in different type of bacteria. So they'll talk about these things very easily, maybe to others, but they won't necessarily talk about a variety of topics. And then if they're younger, if it's a car, they don't want to share the car. They want to sleep with the cars. They want to have their cars in their own hand all the time. So that's something that you can also look out for. And then we also have hypo reactivity to sensory input, like loud noises. They might be aversive, so you see that they cover their ears. Sometimes certain tastes, so they might be very, very picky eaters. They might only eat certain brand of chicken nuggets or Cheerios, and they'll know the difference. They might not like to touch, or they might like touching. So you have sensory aversions, and you also have sensory seeking behaviors, and I'll talk about that in a slide later on as well. And then we have the severity levels for autism. So when we diagnose autism, we usually diagnose a severity level. It can be level 1, which is maybe considered more mild and requires support, level 2 more moderate, and then level 3 can be more severe, meaning that the child needs more help in this area. Now, some of the early red flags for ASD. Let's see what that might look like when they're very young. So, like I mentioned before, responding to name is one of them, not really engaging in pretend play. Sometimes children might pretend that they're cooking or, that they're doing other activities like brushing their hair or brushing their teeth. So they might imitate activities like that, but that might be limited in children with autism when they're younger. Looking at the faces of others, we mentioned this before. They might not really share too much attention or point out things in the environment that they like. So that will be limited as well. And the fact that, when they play with someone, they're not really sharing enjoyment. And we have a video that in one of the later slides that we will see that where you will see where that shared enjoyment is lacking. So here we have a video about, and you can see here where the child is not really responding to their name.
You want to try to see if you can respond to that? CAD can begin to respond to reality. You can use touch with his name, like, give him a second. Evan. He likes to pick us, but he's just not good at using the dry contact, but he does smile when you sit down. Evan.
Okay, so here we see that he wasn't really responding to the name. It looked like he really liked the tickling, but he wasn't really directing the smiling at the mom to indicate, hey, I'm enjoying this interaction with you. So that lack of looking at the face of another person, abnormal use of eye contact, that's something that we see which is limited in children. And then failure to show appropriate facial expressions that we talked about before, not really showing a range. And decreased smile in response to their mothers is something that we've seen in infants when they play. That's definitely something that the research has alluded to. Okay, so in terms of conventional social game things like playing peekaboo, maybe they're not really kind of sharing in that enjoyment of that routine. Typically, if you play peekaboo, you might cover your face, and the child might remove your face to kind of indicate that they want to play some more. Or you put a towel or a blanket over, and they won't necessarily pull the blanket down because that's kind of their way of indicating that they want to play more. So maybe you might not see that. And then imitating gestures, you might see less of the gestures like pointing or using descriptive gestures like saying, oh, look, that's so big. So those are kind of things that you want to keep an eye out for. And then I have a video here.
I'm sorry. Here it is. Ready, set. Push. Stop. What? Here it is. Sit the tape. Stay up here, please.
So we see here the difference between these two, boys, where Benjamin was definitely engaged. He was smiling. He was making eye contact. He was, pushing the truck to the mom. So it was clear that he was engaging and he was enjoying the interaction with the mom. But with Nathan, not so much. He was kind of turning his body away. He wasn't really kind of looking at her. He wasn't really smiling at her and trying to take turns the way that his twin brother was. So that's an example of what we mean when they're not really sharing enjoyment with you. Then we have some differences in early play, like visual inspection. That's when they grab an object and they visually inspect it. So maybe they'll grab an object very close that they like, and they might just go like this very closely. Sometimes they might engage in peering, which is when they look at things from the corner of their eyes like this. So those are some red flags. And then the preoccupation with object parts, like if they're playing with a car, they might just focus on the wheels of the cars instead of actually playing with the car the way it's intended to. So we have, obviously, like we mentioned before, fewer relational acts when they're playing with others, and more kind of stereotypical behavior, which is kind of like auto ways of playing with toys, like lining up toys the way that you see here in the picture. And then one of the things that we also see is that when they play with objects, it tends to be less time spent in functional play. So it's more playing with things like maybe spinning the wheels of the toy, or maybe they have a car, or maybe they have a propeller and they're spinning the propeller. you know. So that's something that we typically see with children on the spectrum. And then this is a video here where you see kind of an example of stereotyped way of playing. Okay, so here you see that the child has a variety of toys around him. He has someone else that is in there with him who is trying to play with him. But he's really focused on opening and closing the doors of the little kitchen area. So he's not really focused on the other toys, but he's focused on just opening and closing the doors repetitively. So that's an example of stereotyped way of playing with toys. And then we have difficulties, like I mentioned before, with imitative play, which typically may begin around age 2 or so. So they might not engage in like pretending to play house, school, or doctor, where they get a stethoscope and you're listening to the heartbeat of someone else. That probably will be limited. And then we have things like they play with non-toy items like maybe rocks or strings, and they might get soap and kind of try to peel the soap little by little. They might try to peel stickers off of things. So that's kind of where their interest might be, which is a little bit different than typically developing peers. And then we talked about they playing with the toy in the same way each time. So they might get the same toy and play with it the same way, like I mentioned before, spinning the wheels of the cars. Or maybe if they have maybe a baby doll, they might just focus on flicking the baby doll's eyes repetitively. So those are some things to look out for. So this is a child here who the mom is trying to get him to play with the other toy functionally, but he's just playing focused on playing with the net and putting the fish in and out. I'm just kind of taking the net in and out, in and out. So it's more repetitive behavior and engaging more functional play, like putting the fish in the little bucket. So that's something that we see here, which is an example of a stereotyped way of playing. Now, when we talk about restricted repetitive behaviors, I know that we alluded to this earlier and we covered some of these. But motor repetitive, stereotyped motor mannerisms can include a variety of things. It can be hand flapping, and it might be when they're excited, finger posturing, which is, we have the third picture here in the PowerPoint, and it's the way they position their fingers, which is considered to be odd by the casual observer. Sometimes they might do something like this with their fingers when they're just kind of walking. So you'll notice that. Sometimes you might see toe walking, and that might be an aversion to the sensation of hitting the ground every time. Spinning is something that we see, jumping, rocking, like I mentioned before. And then we have visually inspecting objects, like I showed you guys earlier. And then opening and closing doors or flicking lights on and off. That's something that sometimes we do see. And then here we have another video. So this is an example of a repetitive word movement, which includes spinning. So you see that there. And with restricted repetitive behavior, I think it's also important, I mentioned before, for the younger kids, it might be numbers, letters, dinosaurs, it might be Thomas the Train, cars. As they get older, you might see maybe they have a fixated interest on train schedules, on license plates, on bacteria, on certain. I evaluated a child who was into whales, and he showed me all the different types of whales that there exist, and I was just like, wow, that's a lot of whales, and I've never heard of some of these names. And he only wanted to talk about that. When I switched the topic to something about me, he didn't really show any interest, and he always took it back or related it back to his interests. So you can see how that can get in the way of social functioning. So definitely very, narrow interest, and not really kind of involving the other person or asking about the other person's thoughts, feelings, experiences. And you can see how that can interfere with the social functioning, because you're only talking to someone about things that you like and not really asking them about their experiences, what they like. Then that's going to affect relationships. So when they get older, you might see a little bit more of those social demands increase, and therefore it might be a little bit more obvious, especially in those children who have more subtle differences. And then with sensory hypo, we have hypo stimulation and hyper stimulation. So we have children who are overly stimulated. So they have difficulty filtering out what's important in the environment. So these are children who, in response to loud sounds like fire alarms, will cover their ears because they have difficulty regulating that sensory input from the environment. And then we also have those children who are understimulated. So they're looking for that stimulation in the environment, and they need extra stimulation. So you might see that they're touching the walls. You might see that they're mouthing things. You might see that they're chewing on things. You might see that they're constantly touching different things. So there's sometimes where they have some sensory seeking behaviors and also some sensory aversions. Some of the common things that we see aversions to are sand, sometimes slime, Play-Doh. Sometimes they don't like to be dirty. They don't like feeling sticky when they play with something. Certain clothing will definitely be bothersome to them. Sometimes tags in their clothing. Sometimes they don't wear certain textures like jeans, or like brushing their teeth or brushing their hair. Those are the things that they might be sensitive to. So here, this is not really a great picture, but you see that when the child is playing, he was kind of just focusing on the way it was opening and closing instead of actually putting it into the little slide where you're supposed to put this toy through. So that's also an example of kind of odd ways of playing with toys, where you're not really playing with it the way it's supposed to, but you're actually playing with it in a different way. Now, some of the misconceptions of ASD. Some of the things that we want to kind of debunk are many children with autism have intellectual deficits or delays. So this is not true. So there are many children who are actually, average, have average functioning in terms of their cognitive functioning. So it doesn't mean that because you have autism, you're automatically, delayed in terms of your intellectual functioning, or that you're automatically a savant. So some children are very, very smart. Some children are average, and some children are below average. So there is a spectrum in terms of their cognitive functioning. The other thing is that sometimes you hear is that individuals with autism can't make eye contact. Okay, so this is not true. So they have the ability to make eye contact, but it's just a matter of teaching them what is appropriate and what's not appropriate. So sometimes you might say you have to make sure you make eye contact, but since they're very literal, then this is where they might just stare at you because they were told they needed to make eye contact. So they might just stare at you without understanding the social implications that staring has an implication where it might be threatening, it might be, kind of odd, and the other person might not like that. So that's why it's important for them to understand some of those rules about social interactions that might not be so self-explanatory for them. Because with autism, they tend to be very literal and it tend to be very, it's hard for them. They have rigid thinking patterns, so it's hard to kind of think outside the box. And in terms of rigidity, you see a lot of that lack of flexibility. So a lack of flexibility can be about routines. Maybe they like a certain routine, and when you come out of that routine, it's very difficult for them because it's safe to have a routine. It's safe to know what's going to happen next because they can mentally prepare for what's happening. But when they don't know what's happening and you kind of throw off the schedule for them, that's when they have difficulties. That's when they have difficulties adapting to change because they've encoded things in a certain sequence. And when you take them out of that, then they don't know how to it's overwhelming for them. So repetitive behaviors should be eliminated or stopped. So, that's not something that, even though it's one of the things that you want to reduce so they can be more adaptive and you want to replace them more maladaptive with more adaptive behaviors, there should be a focus to kind of reduce that so they can be more socially appropriate. But kind of saying you should eliminate it, you're going to work on this and we're going to eliminate it by next month. So that's probably, kind of unrealistic. But you can kind of work on kind of decreasing that and replacing a more adaptive behavior. So that's not something that, that we should say, oh, it needs to be eliminated. That's a misconception. People with autism do not build relationships. So there's this idea that people with autism can't build solid relationships with others. And that's not true. They might have more difficulties and have more difficulties, but some of them have a desire to build relationships. They just don't know how to go about it. And that's really the issue. One of the other misconceptions is people with autism cannot do much of anything functional. And this is not true. And I think it's a disservice to think, oh, because somebody has autism, you have to dismiss them and think that they cannot, be able to function independently and get a job. No, that's not true. There are different severities, but just because someone has autism, it doesn't mean you can dismiss them as saying that they're not functional. Because there are a lot of individuals with autism that I know someone who's on the spectrum and they're an astronaut. I know another person who's an accountant. So it's not to say that because you have a diagnosis of autism that you won't be able to succeed. Okay, definitely not. All right, so in terms of the diagnosis, this is really up to the parents. If you are a teacher and you kind of addressed or communicated some of the concerns during a teacher-parent conference with the parents, once you communicated your concerns with your teacher, then it's the parents' decision whether they want to evaluate the child or not. But at least if there were red flags and you were able to kind of communicate that, and they've understood that, then it's their, kind of their choice whether they want to access services in terms of getting them an evaluation. So access to services is important, but in order to get access to services, oftentimes insurance requires a diagnosis. And that's where we come in because we do an entire evaluation. And the purpose of that is because we want to make recommendations for therapies for anything that the child might be benefit from in order to help them succeed. And that's really the main goal of why we do evaluations. The earlier you provide therapies, the earlier you provide the diagnosis, the earlier they provide get services, then the better the prognosis, and that's according to the research. And it's also important because it answers many questions the parents have. If you're a parent and you're not really sure what might be happening to your child, You definitely don't lose anything. Parents don't lose anything with getting your child evaluated because you learn about their functioning. You learn where they are cognitively. You learn where they are socially. You learn about their strengths. You learn about their weaknesses. There really isn't anything to lose, but there's a lot to gain. And then it can answer many of the questions that you have. So rather than thinking, I don't know if my child, has just a global developmental delay or autism and kind of being in this place of uncertainty, if you can get access to an evaluation, you can kind of address those concerns and you can have a peace of mind because once you have a diagnosis, if there is one, it doesn't mean that every child has a diagnosis, we can kind of lay out a plan for you. These are the therapies that you need, and this is what's going to help your child succeed right now. So we can answer a lot of questions and it can give you some inclusion to autism resources that we can connect you with. So if you are a teacher and you're trying to make an appropriate referral, you want to know with your supervisor, hey, I'm noticing these concerns in your child. Maybe we should set up a parent-teacher conference. And it's also important to make sure you establish a relationship with the parents before you kind of note any concerns to them. Because a lot of the times the parents might know that something might be off. But if you're constantly kind of just talking about what's negative about the child, the parents are not going to be receptive to what you have to bring to the table. So focusing on the child's strengths, because we all have strengths, regardless of whether we have autism, regardless of what diagnosis we have, we all have strengths and we all have weaknesses. So kind of highlight those strengths, build a relationship with those parents in order for them to be able to be more receptive to maybe thinking about getting an evaluation. And being with them through the process is going to be helpful as well. And of course, if you are ever, in need of an evaluation to determine whether, maybe your child has some red flags for autism, maybe there's some red flags for developmental delays, we're always here to help you. We do evaluations and we are happy to help every single family that comes through our clinic in the best way possible. So you can feel free to reach out to us at MSC Clinics at NOAA.edu. And we also have our phone number here. And we are here for anything that you need. We are happy to help children and families and get you connected with any services that might be beneficial to you. All right, well, I hope that, any questions that you had were kind of clarified in terms of what the red flags of autism are with this presentation, and I hope that it was helpful, it was informative, and always feel free to reach out to us if you need anything regarding an evaluation. We are happy to help, like I said before. Well, thank you and have a great day.